Good afternoon. Welcome to the Connecticut Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old State House. My name is Rebecca Tabor Conover. I'm head of public programs here, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to another conversation at noon. You may think that contested elections are recent occurrences, but they are not. Today's program, Contested Elections, Nothing New, spotlights some of the more contentious elections in our nation's history. As you're watching today's program, please do post any questions you might have for our speaker to answer, and you can post them in the comments section underneath the broadcast. I'd also invite you at the end of the program to fill out our survey, which can be found in the description for today's program. It's a very short survey, and we really, truly do appreciate your feedback. It's always a special pleasure to invite and welcome friends of Connecticut Democracy Center to our programs. And today, we are happy to welcome Dr. Matthew Warshauer. Dr. Warshauer is a professor at Central Connecticut State University. He's been there since 1997. And in 2018, he received the Distinguished Service Award from the university. He is an alumnus of CCSU, and he received his master's and PhD from St. Louis University in American Studies. Dr. Warshauer regularly teaches courses in the Age of Jefferson, the Age of Jackson, American Life, and the Historical Imagination. More recently, he's begun teaching a course called the 9/11 Generation, inspiring his next book project, the premise of which is that there is a 9/11 generation that exists as a result of the terrorist attack. Dr. Warshauer's earlier work focused extensively on the Civil War, as both an author as well as the founder and project coordinator for the Connecticut Civil War Commemoration Commission, which was responsible for commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. Dr. Warshauer has served in the past as the editor for the academic journal Connecticut History. He's been chairperson of Connecticut's Old State House Advisory Committee, and he's been a board member of the Hartford Heritage Advisory Council, as well as Connecticut Humanities. In addition, for the past 5 years, he's been our host for Connecticut History Day's state contest at the CCSU campus. Dr. Warshauer's books include Andrew Jackson and the Politics of Martial Law, Nationalism, Civil Liberties, and Partisanship, and Connecticut and the American Civil War, Slavery, Sacrifice, and Survival. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Matthew Warshauer to today's program.
Rebecca, I appreciate it, and hello to everybody. I'm always excited to do programming for the Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old State House. It's a great place, and hopefully when all of this COVID madness is gone, we can all congregate and meet there and do these things in person again. So when Rebecca contacted me and asked me if I would do a program on contested elections, I thought, what I imagine many of you thought is like, no, I don't want to talk about presidential elections anymore. But we are in a particular reality. Perhaps we will talk a little bit more at the end of the program of what that reality is. But, certainly the United States is in contentious times when it comes to politics, partisanship, the presidency. I think one of the things, and I'll just preface with this, one of the things that, we hear a lot about the founders, right? And I think one of the things that the founders would want us to remember is that what we are engaged in as citizens of the United States is really a grand experiment in representative democracy. And we can't ever forget that. I think sometimes we do, but this is a continuing experiment. And the only time when the experiment will fail is when we give up on it. And so we need to understand this history. We need to learn it. We need to really improve upon it and carry our nation into the future. So I hope that what I'm going to discuss today gives you a little bit of background on that. And I will do my best to answer your questions at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up my screen. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see just a few PowerPoint slides as I talk through them. And I'm actually going to turn my camera off because you don't need to look at me. You need to look at the slides. So let me bring up my PowerPoint. We'll go to the beginning, and I hope that that's working and you can see. Contested democracy, 6 presidential elections that changed America. We really have to begin with the U.S. Constitution. As I'm sure most of you know, it was written in 1787, went through a 2-year ratification process to actually be put in place. It replaced the Articles of Confederation, which were the first form of government. It created a much more powerful government. We need to remember that under the Articles of Confederation, there was no chief executive. We had no president. Those from the colonial period, the revolutionaries, were terrified over the power, over kingly or monarchical power that might develop.
And excuse me for interrupting, Matt. I apologize for that. We're not seeing your screen with your slide. Thanks everyone for hanging on with us. We have a slight technical issue. We're taking care of that. And I think, Matt, you might just have to turn on your camera. While we're waiting, I just wanted to mention to folks that we do hope that you will be joining us for some other programs. We're working at getting Dr. Warshauer back, so we're going to just do a little commercial break while we're waiting for him to rejoin us. I did want to just mention that with our public programs, as you know, we've been doing virtual programs for a couple of months now here at the Connecticut Democracy Center. And so we would really invite you to join us for a few upcoming programs in the next couple of weeks. Each month we are starting to choose a theme. And so this month our theme is education. And so we'll be looking at 3 different programs that touch on education. The first of those is a conversation at noon, and it will be on Tuesday, November the 17th. And that will be from, that will be on the lasting legacy of the Litchfield Law School, which is America's first school of law, and the director of the Litchfield Historical Society will be joining us for that program. And coming up after that is Thursday, November the 19th, is which will be at 7 o'clock, is an evening conversation, a clean slate, clearing room for the complete story of Crandall's Canterbury School. Many of you are familiar with Prudence Crandall, who is our state's heroine. And so we're going to have Joni DiMartino, who is the site manager for the Prudence Crandall House, join us for that program and talk a little bit about some of the ongoing renovations and reinterpretation of the Prudence Crandall story. And then rounding out our public programs will be on November the 30th, one of our legislative landmarks programs, which will be on the American School for the Deaf. Some of you might know that the School for the Deaf was founded here in Hartford. It was founded as the American Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb, and the legislation to start the school was passed here at Connecticut's Old State House. And so we will be talking with 2 members of the American School for the Deaf on that date, and that will be November the 30th at 3 p.m. And we're just going to pause for a second. And we are still trying to bring Dr. Warshauer back. We apologize for the technical glitches. We will be on pause for just a second. If
Okay, is it on? Oh boy. Well, that's the first time that's happened in a digital talk. I apologize for the technical difficulty, but I was apparently giving myself an outstanding lecture on the early electoral college. So let's try this again. I'm going to stay on with you, and I'm going to start over. All right. So are we good here now, Rebecca? Or somebody?
yes, we're good.
Excellent. So we're going to start over. I'm going to go through this. I had begun talking about the Electoral College, the U.S. Constitution, the fact that the U.S. Constitution is created to replace the Articles of Confederation. And the reason for that is because the Articles of Confederation are not functioning effectively. The government just simply doesn't have enough power to operate the way that it needs to. There was, under the Articles of Confederation, no chief executive. The people of the Revolutionary period were extremely concerned about monarchical power, and that any chief executive of the United States would ultimately become a king. And so when the new U.S. Constitution comes into being, when it's ratified and goes into effect into 1789, they create the Electoral College under the executive branch. And you can see here it says, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. The way that works is that the number of electors in the United States is equal to the number of representatives that we have. So each state has a certain number of representatives based on population. So obviously larger state populations have more representative than smaller state populations. And then, so 435 today, total number of representatives, and then equal to the number of senators that each state has. The number of senators never changes. So each state has 2 senators, therefore 100 senators, 100 additional electors. So there are 435 electors, plus an additional 3 for the District of Columbia, for a total of 538 electors. What it says below this is the person having the greatest number of votes shall be the president, if such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed. And if there be more than one who have such majority, and have an equal number of votes, then the House of Representatives shall immediately choose by ballot one of them for president, and if no person have a majority, then from the 5 highest on the list, the said House shall in like manner choose the president. But in choosing the presidents, the votes shall be taken by states, the representative from each state having 1 vote. All right, what does all of that mean? What it means is that whoever wins the most number of electors in a given electoral vote becomes president of the United States. The person who wins the second number of electoral votes becomes vice president until the 12th Amendment is ratified. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. There was no presidential, formal presidential and vice presidential slate. The belief was, the hope was on the part of the founding fathers, is that permanent political parties would not exist in the United States. It's not that they didn't understand political parties were a thing, that they were an entity. They certainly knew their history. The issue was they believed that the United States was a large enough nation with enough differing interests that there would never be a permanent political party system that would develop around only 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 sets of issues. Rather, issues would constantly be shifting and changing over a period of time. The belief was also that any person who was going to be chosen as a presidential candidate, and I say chosen as opposed to declare their candidacy, because in the early republic, it would have been considered unseemly for any individual to say, oh, I think I should be president. This is a gift of the people. This was the concept. So anyone who would be chosen would be considered a statesman and a representative for the entire United States, not for one state or region or party. With that in mind, the founders believed, well, since they're all going to be statesmen, the person who wins the most electoral votes should be president. The person who wins the second most, well, they're good too. They should become vice president. And that doesn't change until the 12th Amendment. So could you imagine today, President Donald J. Trump with Hillary Rodham Clinton as her vice president? I hope that put a smile on your face, because none of us could imagine this right now. So let's continue along, and we'll talk a little bit more about how all this works out. The first contested election in American history is 1800, Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams. We all, of course, know that George Washington is the first president of the United States. He serves 2 terms. And then in the election of 1796, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams run against one another. And as I was just describing, John Adams wins the presidency with the most electoral votes, and Thomas Jefferson wins the second most electoral votes and becomes vice president. Well, the campaigning and the preparation for the election of 1800 begins immediately, because during Washington's presidency, what the founders had hoped would not happen does indeed happen. And that is that permanently entrenched political parties come into existence. It is essentially the Hamiltonian Federalists versus the Jeffersonian Republicans. Adams is a member of the Federalist Party. He becomes president, as I said, in 96. And then Jefferson and Adams are in a heated battle against one another. This election of 1800 is up there in terms of some of the most aggressive and mean-spirited campaigning in the history of the United States. So if you hear any pundits or journalists say, oh, we need to go back to the good old days, they haven't studied their early American history. What ends up happening in the election of 1800 is that Thomas Jefferson and his presumed vice president, Aaron Burr, they tie in the electoral vote count, 73 electoral votes apiece. John Adams and his presumed vice presidential candidate or nominee, Charles Pinckney, wins 65 and 64 respectively. Now, if we go back to that previous slide that I talked about of what happens in the occasion of a tie, well, then the Electoral College, this section of the Constitution states that if there's a tie, the election then devolves to the House of Representatives itself. The popular votes really no longer matter. It now comes down to state voting. And in this instance, each state gets one single vote for who's going to be president. So size no longer matters. It doesn't matter if Virginia and New York are considerably larger than, say, Connecticut or Rhode Island. Their various representatives are going to have to sit down at a table and decide, well, who becomes president? Well, this becomes a real issue in the election of 1800 because there are real concerns over both of these men. The Federalists look at Jefferson as a dangerous Jacobin. This would been a sect of a religious sect in France that allows, as the Federalists believe, to allow blood to pour in the streets, and how bloody and dangerous the French Revolution is. They have been worried that this is what's going to happen under Jefferson. Now, Burr is a different sort of a character. He is viewed by many Federalists, especially Alexander Hamilton, who knew him well and ultimately died from a bullet fired from Burr's gun a few years later in 1804. Hamilton does not trust Burr, and he literally states at one point that Burr cannot be trusted with the reins of government. That is, in fact, the quote that got Hamilton shot. So there's a big question here, and the Federalists understand that they can actually decide who is going to be president, whether it's going to be Jefferson and Burr. That's whom they have to choose from. There are actually 35 separate House ballots in the House of Representatives to determine who's going to be president. There are a number of people, historians, who have believed that Burr attempted to steal this election away from Jefferson. Jefferson, in fact, believed that Burr attempted to steal the election. And once this election is over, Burr is basically read out of the Republican Party. Jefferson does not choose him again as his running mate and really has nothing to do with Burr. My belief, was Burr a scoundrel? Yeah, Burr was a bit of a scoundrel. He was a very, very good politician. I don't believe Jefferson could potentially have been elected without Burr's help. But I think that Burr has gotten a bit of a bad rap over this. That's a longer conversation, but it's interesting. Jefferson is actually the one who makes a deal with Federalists and wins on the 36th ballot to become president of the United States. And this, in fact, in the aftermath of this election, this is what spurs the 12th Amendment of the Constitution. And this amendment states, the electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for president and vice president. So now they have split between voting for a president and voting for a vice president. This is still the way that things occur, though today, with more modern politicking, we understand that tickets are put together with the president and vice president. And the president obviously has a lot to say about who the vice presidential choice shall be. So it then goes on to say, the person having the greatest number of votes for president shall be the president, if such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed. So you can't just win a plurality of the electoral votes. You must win a majority of them. You have to have a specific number. It then states, if no person has such majority, then from the persons having the highest numbers, not exceeding 3 on the list of those voted for as president, the House of Representatives shall choose immediately by ballot the president. So the House of Representatives still gets to choose if there's a problem in the electoral vote, if there's a tie, or if the president doesn't win the requisite majority number of electoral votes. The House will still decide, but they have reduced the number of people to choose from the 5 highest electoral vote recipients to the 3 highest electoral vote recipients. And this does matter in a few elections down the road, one of which I will discuss. It then states, the person having the greatest number of votes as vice president shall be the vice president, if such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed. If no person have a majority, then the 2 highest numbers on the list, the Senate shall choose the vice president. So if there's a problem in the electoral vote count for the vice president, then the Senate will make that decision. Generally speaking, however, and I'm aware only of a few times in American history where the electoral votes that are cast for the president are not also cast equally for the vice president. It's sort of an anomaly if that occurs. So let's continue on. The election of 1824, John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson. This is one of those important times when that reduction from 5 to 3 really matters. And I'll explain why in a moment. But we also have to understand that from about 1817 to about 1824-25, it is a tremendously unique period in American history when there is no political party system. We go back, we essentially, in the aftermath of the War of 1812, revert back to what the founders and James Madison had hoped for, which was one party to which everyone belonged. And there would be constantly shifting issues on which that party focused. So after the War of 1812, the Federalist Party essentially disintegrates. It ceases to exist. Older Federalists retire. Younger Federalists like John Quincy Adams end up joining the Republican Party, the National Republican Party. And so in this election in 1824, you've got all Republicans running against one another. John Quincy Adams is really probably the most he is the most qualified person to serve as president. Since being a young man, he had served as his father, John Adams, as secretary. He had served in that capacity in Great Britain, in Russia. He had served in a variety of different capacities as a cabinet officer, especially as Secretary of State under James Monroe. And so John Quincy Adams is amazingly well educated and has had a lifetime in politics, even at a fairly young age. Andrew Jackson is most famous for being the hero of New Orleans. He wins national fame, first to some extent as an Indian fighter during the War of 1812, but then really for his amazing victory over the British on January 8th, 1850 at the Battle of New Orleans. And he becomes a national figure, very, very popular, second really in military popularity only to George Washington. Then you have William Crawford, who was really sort of an old school Jeffersonian Republican. He had served as Secretary of the Treasury under James Monroe. And he's from Georgia, I should say, where these gentlemen are from. John Quincy Adams is Massachusetts, Andrew Jackson is Tennessee, and William Crawford is from Georgia. And then Henry Clay runs. Clay is from Kentucky. He really desperately wants to be the first president from the West. He is a young and upcoming Republican this time. He makes his fame as a war hawk, somebody who advocates early on in 1811, 1812 for war against Great Britain, which becomes the War of 1812, and for fighting on behalf of American sovereignty in that war. At the time of this election, he is Speaker of the House. That is extremely significant because, of course, if no one wins the requisite number of electoral votes, in this instance 131, then the election devolves to the House of Representatives. When you are the Speaker of the House of Representatives, that is an extremely powerful position. So if the Constitution had continued the way it was, where the 5 highest vote getters, electoral vote recipients, are chosen by the House, Henry Clay might very well have become president then. William Crawford, just as a side note, is really out of the running for this. While he still is on the electoral vote, he wins quite a number of popular and electoral votes. Well prior to the election, he had a massive stroke and was largely incapacitated. And most people in the nation knew this. They knew he was not going to become the next president. So what it really ends up coming down to is John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson. And as you can see in the box on the right, Jackson actually wins far more popular votes and a significant number more electoral votes than John Quincy Adams. So Jackson and his supporters really believe that in the House of Representatives, he is going to become president of the United States, unless Henry Clay has something to say about it. And Clay has 2 issues with Jackson. One, he wants to be the first. Clay wants to be the first president from the West. Second, He doesn't trust Andrew Jackson. He has already referred to Andrew Jackson as a dangerous military chieftain. He believes that Jackson is a military power, and that if he becomes president, he will destroy this young republic in its infancy. Jackson and Clay are not friendly by the election of 1824, certainly not friendly. And when this ends up in the House of Representatives, John Quincy Adams wins in the House vote 13-7. And he even wins Kentucky's vote, where he had previously won no electoral votes at all. In Kentucky, Clay had won some electoral votes. And when he is not, chosen as one of these three highest electoral vote recipients, the legislature of Kentucky actually writes its representatives and said, we want you to cast your ballot for Andrew Jackson. And Henry Clay steps in and subverts that move. Thus, the reason that Kentucky ends up voting for John Quincy Adams. Well, that's not the end of the world. When in February of 1825, the House determines that John Quincy Adams is president of the United States, there's not a big issue. There's no explosions in the newspapers. There's no complaining from Jackson. That doesn't occur until about a little less than 2 weeks later, when John Quincy Adams appoints Henry Clay as Secretary of the State. And you've got to understand how significant this is, because Secretary of State, rather than the vice presidency, Secretary of State is the traditional stepping stone to the president. So think about this. Thomas Jefferson had been Secretary of State. James Madison had been Secretary of State. James Monroe had been Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams had been Secretary of State. So the fact that Adams chooses Henry Clay, many believe that that's sort of a nod to Clay, that you will someday be president. And the fact that Henry Clay played such an important role in the House vote to choose John Quincy Adams, that does cause Andrew Jackson and his supporters to cry foul. And hence the term corrupt bargain begins. Jackson actually makes the statement, the Judas of the West, meaning Henry Clay, has collected his 30 pieces of silver. And this is a quote from the Gospel of Matthew, that Judas will collect his 30 pieces of silver for betraying Jesus. And so really the campaigning for the election of 1828 begins immediately after 1825. And you get the beginnings, as a result of this election, you get the beginnings of the Second American Party system, where when Andrew Jackson's supporters become Democratic Republicans and ultimately drop the name Republican completely and just go as Democrats or Jacksonian Democrats, and John Quincy Adams' supporters continue being National Republicans or just Republicans. And it leads us to our next contested, not to our next contested election, to 1828, in which Andrew Jackson wins handily over John Quincy Adams and serves 2 full terms. Our next really contested election isn't until after the American Civil War. I do want to stop for a moment and mention the election of 1860. I don't have a slide for it, but it's worth mentioning. It's not a contested election. Abraham Lincoln obviously runs, but the reason that Lincoln is able to win that election in 1860 is because the Democratic Party splits between northern and southern wings, and in fact runs candidates from the North and the South. They run Stephen Douglas for the North and John C. Breckinridge for the South, and that splits the Democratic vote. If you actually look at the numbers for the election of 1860, you'll see that the 2 Democratic candidates in fact win more popular votes than Lincoln does. But because the party is split, and the way the Electoral College works, Lincoln wins the presidency, and we know that leads to civil war. Well, the next contested election doesn't occur until the aftermath of the American Civil War. This is the election of 1876. It is Samuel J. Tilden versus Rutherford B. Hayes. This is again one of these examples where the person who wins, and there have only been 5 instances in American history, the only election that it isn't that way as the election of 1800. Jefferson wins the most popular votes and does become president. All of the rest of the contested electoral votes from 1824 all the way through the 2000 election, the person who wins the popular vote does not become president. And this is another one of those instances. So 1876, and you can see in the blue box to your right that Hayes wins 4,034,311 votes, whereas Tilden wins 4,288,546 votes. Hayes wins 165 electoral votes. Tilden wins 184. So how is it that Tilden doesn't become president? Why? Because in order to win the majority of electoral votes at this time, you need 185. So in this instant, Tilden needs one electoral vote. Hayes needs 20 electoral votes. And guess how many electoral votes are contested? Well, if you're looking at my second bullet point, you know there are 20 contested electoral votes. I don't think a lot of us are going to be surprised that Florida is one of those states. And you can see next to it, there are 4 contested votes in Florida, 8 in Louisiana, 7 in South Carolina, and 1 in Oregon. And so this is a unique election because there are contested electoral votes. It's not just that no one won the majority of electoral votes. So if you think about 1824 versus this election, you can see other candidates that ran, but they didn't receive any electoral votes. That's what happened in 24. There, other people received electoral votes, and therefore no candidate was able to get the majority number that they needed. This election is different because all of the electoral votes have been cast, but there are 20 that are in dispute in these 4 states. So what ends up, one of 2 things could have happened. It could devolve to the House of Representatives, and the House could therefore vote and make a determination as to who was going to be president, or the House could make a determination to do something different, and that's what they end up doing. They create an electoral commission. They're trying to make this as fair as possible. 15-person commission. There are going to be 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent. The single independent that is going to sit on this, and this is going to be made up of senators, representatives, and a Supreme Court justice. The Supreme Court justice is David Davis. Well, in the midst of this electoral commission, Davis is elected to become the senator of Illinois. And he's replaced on the commission by Justice Joseph Bradley, who is not an independent, but a Republican. And he votes with the other 7 Republicans on the commission. And the commission determines that all 20 of the contested electoral ballots, all of the electoral votes, should be given to Rutherford B. Hayes. And of course, the Democrats look at this and they cry fraud, and they say, we're going to allow this to happen. And their only means of stopping it, because the commission has made its determination, is to not allow the commission report to be read in Congress. And the way that they go about doing that is by filibustering. And a filibuster is when various members, well, it could be a single member, it could be various members of the House or the Senate, stand up inside the congressional chamber, and they just refuse to yield the floor, and they keep talking, and you can't then have a commission report and then an acknowledgement of the report. So this, really becomes a chess game between the 2 parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. And the way that they solve this deadlock is that they come up with what is known as the Compromise of 1877. That compromise gives the 20 electoral votes to Hayes. So he will, in fact, become president. But it also is an agreement to end Reconstruction in the South. At the end of the American Civil War, when there are problems with President Andrew Johnson, the Republicans in Congress impose a Reconstruction bill, which is known as radical Reconstruction. Part of that is that they break the South into 5 military districts and send generals down to command each of these districts. So the Union Army is literally in the South for about 10 years or so. And Southerners want them gone. The Democratic Party, while at the end of the Civil War is at a very low ebb, over the next 10 years, it starts to regain its strength. This election reveals that with how close Tilden came to winning the presidency. So they have enough political clout to require Republicans to pull the military out of the South. What does that really mean? As I said, it means that the Democratic Party is increasing its power in the aftermath of the Civil War, but it also means a very, very bad time for the freedmen, for the enslaved people who have been freed as a result of the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the 13th Amendment. But it really, in a lot of ways, is an abandonment of them. The military had been in the South in order to protect the freedmen's rights. So what this really is it's an end of Northern commitment to Reconstruction, and you get the rise of the Jim Crow era. Just 20 years after this, in 1896, you will get the Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson, which essentially institutionalizes or federalizes the idea of separate but equal, which is Jim Crow. And so the United States really, reels from this for the next 100 years or so, 98 years. It's not until 1968 that President Johnson signs in the Voting Rights Act. That's the first piece of civil rights legislation passed since the end of Reconstruction. So this Compromise of 1877 has, real and lasting impact on the United States. And, not that I'm going to go far into it, but, the issues that we witnessed as Americans this summer about Black Lives Matter and protests and the violence that accompanied some of that. I think the majority of those were nonviolent, but there was some violence related to it. That is merely the next evolution, the next movement of the civil rights movement to become. Luther King. And so Black Lives Matter is the next evolution of that fight. And it stems from this long racial and political history in the United States. So that's who is the grandson of William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison has the distinction of being the first president to die in office. He wins the election of 8.
And I think we're having some trouble, Matt, with your camera freezing a little. Matt, can you hear us? Well, tomorrow is Friday the 13th, but I think the gremlins are out today on the 12th. If we're going to try to have a chance to have some question and answers with Matt, we're going to try to bring him back. It looks like his camera, he's frozen out. And we'll just try to bring him back for a second. If you have any questions, please do post them in the comments section, and hopefully we're trying to reach Dr. Warshauer now and get him back online with us. If you can just bear with us for a second. And if you have a chance, do fill out the survey that is located to the in the description, and we will just try to bring him back if you could bear with us. And just a second.
There, I'm there.
All right.
Hello, everybody. Yet another technical glitch. Apologies for that. I don't know why I've never had it happen before. So let me just return to here, and we will pull up this, and we'll start from the current slide. I believe where we ended up was that I was finishing up on the election of 1888. We come into the election of 2000, which is an election that we all lived through, or I would imagine the majority of people lived through. We know how close this election was, and the fact that Al Gore defeats George W. Bush in the popular vote by 0.5%, but loses the Electoral College 271 to 261. There is one Gore elector who abstains from voting. This was a woman named Barbara Simmons. She withheld her electoral vote as a protest because the District of Columbia does not have a representative in Congress, and she believes that it relegates it to colonial status. So she threw her electoral vote away. It would not, of course, have made a difference because it wouldn't have.
Okay. We're going to see if we can get Matt back. Give it a couple moments. We apologize. We've never had such problems with broadcast before, so we appreciate all of your patience in sticking with us. It's really interesting. I think, I know as I've been listening to Dr. Warshauer, just thinking a little bit about how elections have evolved over time, and the fact that, we kind of think, oh, we've been doing the same thing for so many years, and yet we haven't, that things have changed with the addition of amendments, and reminding us too that there have been some pretty contentious elections in our nation's history. It's interesting to really think about that a little bit. And I have to kind of laugh when we first talked about this program maybe a week or two ago. We were thinking that all of the election brouhaha would be over, and obviously we're still in the midst of that. So it's a good reminder. One thing, having lived through the Bush-Gore election issues, is it really does just go to show how important it is to vote, because it came down to 500 votes, which is pretty amazing.
541. If you at home are frustrated, you're not as frustrated as Rebecca and I. Okay, trust us on this one. I am going to try this again. Can you see the screen, Rebecca?
I don't see your screen.
Okay, so I'm going to try one more time. I'm going to share screen, share screen. Here we go. You should see it now. Can you see it, Rebecca?
I don't. I still just see you.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to finish this out with just the old-fashioned hi. How are you?
That works.
Okay. So what I was talking about with the election of 2000, it's 541 votes. The contested elections are in Florida. The real difficulty, just to cut to the chase, the real difficulty with the election of 2000 is that there are those contested elections and there are recounts that are going on. And there are controversies over the recounts. And the real problem with this election is the fact that the date for sort of the date of no return, where the ballots have to be turned in and read to the Congress, is coming. And so there is a rush to get this in and make a determination. The problem with the election of 2000 is the Supreme Court gets involved and calls a halt to the recounts. In the view of a lot of political scientists, historians, constitutional historians, this act was in fact unconstitutional. They should not have done it. Generally speaking, the Supreme Court of the United States assiduously avoids those kinds of political determinations. If those contested electoral votes could not have been counted from Florida because there was a problem, then it should have devolved to the House of Representatives, as the Constitution says, and as every previous contested election that had happened earlier had been done. So the election of 2000 is very problematic, and it's a very, very changed history for not only the United States but the world, because 9/11 occurs in the immediate aftermath. And Rebecca mentioned that's something that I've been teaching and studying and writing on for the last 5 years. I'll leave it at this. It's a topic for another day, but I'll leave it at this. Oh, and I'll ask it in a question. Would President Al Gore, have invaded Iraq in 2003? And I think the answer to that question is a striking no. And that changes the history of the United States and the history of the world. So these contested elections, and every president election, has really serious ramifications. So we then move on to our next and our final contested election, which is the election of 2016, Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. I'm sure that everybody watching remembers that one, because it was only 4 years ago. We had Hillary Clinton win a significantly larger percentage of the vote, almost 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, yet she does not achieve the requisite 270 electoral votes in order to win the presidency. Donald Trump wins the necessary electoral votes. There are 5 faithless electors who defect from Hillary Clinton and 2 faithless electors who defect from Donald Trump. What does that mean? Electors are the way the Electoral College is supposed to work is that electors are supposed to follow whatever the popular vote is. So it's basically in every state in the country, except for, I think it's Nebraska and Maine. It's Nebraska and Maine. Every other state, it's winner take all. So if somebody wins the popular vote, then all the electors from that party get to vote. In Maine and Nebraska, it's broken up. You can have your electoral votes can be broken up by region. But in every other state, it's winner take all. And electors are supposed to follow the popular will. But there are 33 states in the United States that have what are called, faith in elector laws, which actually require the electors to vote. And they can be penalized, they can be replaced, they can be fined. And in fact, just this past summer, I want to remember the court case, Schiaffalo versus Washington, July 16, 2020, the Supreme Court upheld those states' laws, which require electors to be faithful. The problem is that there are some states that don't require that. So you had 5 electors who defected from Hillary Clinton, 2 from Donald Trump. What's particularly interesting is that in 2016, there was actually a movement of Republicans known as Hamilton electors who were hoping to get 37 Republican electors who would vote for somebody other than Donald Trump because they didn't like Trump and they didn't believe he was a true Republican. I think the Republican Party has changed even further under Donald Trump. That perhaps a discussion for a number of days. But there were a total of 10 electors who were faithless. The 7 that I mentioned, 3 of them were invalidated by state laws. They were either replaced or were forced to vote for the person who the popular vote won. What's interesting about Donald Trump, he is the first president in American history with no public service, no military service. He was the oldest president at 70 years old to be inaugurated for a first term. Ronald Reagan was 69. He turned 70 shortly after his inauguration. And he was 73 for his second inauguration. What is really sort of fascinating, there's 2 things. One, will we see Donald Trump run again since he has presumably lost this election in 2020? The electoral votes haven't actually been turned over to the Congress yet, so it's not official until that occurs. But let's presume that he has not won the election of 2020. Does he run again in 2024, like Cleveland did? That's an interesting question. The other really interesting question, and one that I imagine some of you have been thinking about as I've been speaking, is why do we need an electoral college? The reason the Electoral College was created is that the founders did not, in fact, create a democracy. They created a republic, a representative system. Not everybody, there was not universal suffrage or voting rights at this time, not even among white men. You had to have a certain amount of property. So what the Electoral College did was 2 things. One, it protected the well-to-do. It protected the aristocratic leaders of society from stopping people from making a mistake. And 2, it protected the rights of the slaveholding South. And these are 2 critical things to understand. Do we need an electoral college today? I would argue to you that we do not. I believe, and many historians and political scientists believe, that it is singularly undemocratic to not have the popular vote make a decision. Some argue that, well, if you get rid of the Electoral College, the huge states are the only ones who will ever elect a president. I don't believe that math is correct. I don't believe that argument is correct. The fact that each state is given a certain number of electoral votes, and those electoral votes are based on representation in Senate, means that larger states are going to have a bigger vote anyway. So, and and the vote, the difference in the vote count for 2016 of 3 million votes. That's a lot of votes to win the popular vote and not become president. So in my view, my argument is we should get rid of the Electoral College, but that is not going to happen anytime soon. That is for sure. We would need a sea change to occur in this country in terms of a reduction in serious partisan battle, and neither party is prepared for that. So, Rebecca, I'm hoping you still heard all of that.
Yes. Yes, we did. And actually, that was some of the questions that had come in asking about, after the 2016 election, there really did seem to be a grassroots push to get rid of the Electoral College. I know in your comments, you just said that you don't see that happening anytime soon. In past elections that were contested, were there calls to drop the Electoral College, or is that more recent?
Oh, no. There have been multiple times in which there have been discussions to get rid of the Electoral College. Andrew Jackson, after 1824, argued that the Electoral College should be gotten rid of. But, up until the aftermath of the Civil War, it wasn't really going to happen because there were power politics at play in regards to slaveholding and non-slaveholding states. There were some attempts in the aftermath of the Civil War, but none of them really, truly came to fruition. The parties understand that the Electoral College can play in their favor. I think there's a number of things in the United States Constitution that need to be changed at this point. When George Washington was created president in his first inaugural address, he discussed the Constitution, and there were huge disputes over the Constitution as to whether it should be ratified and become the law of the land and form this new government that we have. There were big concerns about federal power. We still have problems over federal versus state power in this country. And when Washington delivers his inaugural address, he says, listen, he goes, I know that you're worried about this new government, but you know what? It hasn't been tested. It hasn't been tried. Don't be in too much of a hurry to amend it. We need to live with it for a while and see how it develops. Only then will we really know what needs to be altered. And over the course of American history, we have changed the Constitution, many, many times. Never easily, because you need a 2/3 vote in the Congress, and then it has to go out to the states for further ratification by 3/4. So it's not an easy process. It was never meant to be an easy process. But I think we're at a point in American history where we need to make some changes. I would argue that one of those changes should be not allowing, first of all, getting rid of the Electoral College, but also not allowing any single party to have a majority in the Congress. So essentially, we'd be legislating into effect the existence of a third party movement. That is difficult to do. Having a number of changes to the Constitution that would be beneficial as opposed to detrimental requires a different political climate than we in the United States have right now. Other questions, Rebecca?
Yes, well, I'm going to just invite audience members who are watching. If you have questions, please put them in the comments because we see them and we will pass them along to Dr. Warshauer. Matt, I wanted to, there is one question that came in, which was, are there any famous contested elections that have happened here in Connecticut? Probably not on the level of a federal election, but
nothing on the level of a federal election. Off the top of my head, I do some Connecticut history. I more do 19th century Connecticut history. None that I can really think of distinct contested elections. In the early part of Connecticut history, the colonial and post-revolutionary period, it's amazing. Walt Woodward, the state historian, has a great PowerPoint on this where he shows the names of the people who are governor for the first many, many years, all the way into the 19th century. And there's a number of families, basically, that you've heard of the standing order. there's a number of families who really maintain a tight control over Connecticut. That doesn't start to open up until around the 1820s, 1830s, and then Connecticut follows along with the development of the rest of the political party system in the United States. In the midst of the Civil War, there are a couple of elections between 1860 and 1863 between William Buckingham, who was a Republican who served all 4 years of the Civil War, and Thomas Seymour, who had been formerly been a governor, runs again against Buckingham. And in 60 and 63, Buckingham wins by just a tiny number of votes. That is as close as I can think of to a really, really tight election. And there were arguments of fraud in the 63 election, but I can't think of another election that would, be on the same level as what we've been talking about today.
Right. One question did come in from our audience. Jennifer asked, do you anticipate faithless electors this time around? Will the Koch brothers attempt to purchase some votes for Trump?
Well, only one Koch brother will, because the other one died. You could have faithless electors. You absolutely could. I think that Biden is far enough ahead in electoral votes that it's going to be all right. I think that Biden is going to become the next president of the United States. I think the bigger question than a problem with the electoral vote is, what happens in the days after the inauguration? The fact that, one of the hallmarks of American democracy is that even in these major contested elections, we have not seen violence in their aftermath. We came close in 1876, but we have not seen violence in the aftermath. This is one of the unique things about American politics, is the peaceful transfer of power. The fact that Donald Trump, in the run-up to this most recent election, refused to state publicly that he would accept the results of the election, that he has continued to argue that there was fraud in this election, when quite a number of prominent Republicans, from Governor Chris Christie to Karl Rove and others, have said, listen, if you've got evidence that there was fraud, then show the evidence. And so far, even in the courts, Republicans have been unable to produce any evidence. Voter fraud on a national level in the United States in recent times is really negligible. I mean, it's just such a tiny point of a percentage. It just really doesn't happen. Prove it if it does, and nobody's been able to do that. I think the bigger question is, will Donald Trump, in the aftermath, is like, one, will we have violence in the aftermath? Will Donald Trump, step back and step out of the political sphere for a period of time? Or will he do what he did during the entire 4 years of his presidency, which was engage in continuous campaigning? This is, whatever you think of Donald Trump, you have to recognize that as a campaigner and as somebody who can rally his base, he is quite brilliant at this. And he went on a 4-year continual campaign tour. It's why voter turnout on his side and the other side was so great this time around. So will he continue that in a 4-year term of Joe Biden, constantly holding rallies, constantly sort of, being critical of Biden and creating problems for a Democratic presidency this time around? And will he be preparing himself for 2024? We just don't know the answers to that. But those possibilities are distinctly possible. I think a lot depends upon the internal workings of the Republican Party itself. It is a party that has, the Democratic Party has been in flux also, but the Republican Party is a party that has been in huge flux. I want to be very clear that Donald Trump is not an outlier when it comes to the Republican Party. He doesn't sort of come out of nowhere. He is a result of Republican Party strategy and planning for the last 20, 30 years. He's a result of it, not an outlier of it. So, but in the aftermath of the 2012 election, Mitt Romney came out and many Republicans came out and said, boy, we really need to rethink how we're approaching voters and appeal to a wider base. Well, Trump proved that the Republican Party can still win without that. Now, granted, there were crossover from Democrats in the 2016 election who wanted change and voted for Trump. But in 2020, there's a lot of people who thought that Biden was going to win much more handily than he did. And so you got a lot of people, including me, who were sort of sitting there going, what's going to happen now? And nobody knows for sure.
And, a couple of the questions, Matt, that have come in kind of relate to what you just were talking about. Is there anything in the Constitution that talks about the transfer of power? And how big a problem is it that the Trump administration for now is refusing to cooperate with the transition to a new administration?
Well, there's nothing in the Constitution that talks about transfer of power. That has become something that is part of the political norm in the United States. One of the things that Trump and Trump Republicans have done, and done so proudly, has been the breaking of those norms. That has been the hallmark of one of the hallmarks of the Trump presidency, is just, we're not doing it the way it's been done before because we don't want to do it that way, or we believe it is a greater advantage to us Republicans if we do it in a different way. So, it's going to be very, very interesting to see what happens. But there have been a wide variety of current and former political leaders, both Democratic and Republicans, many members of the Lincoln Project who are conservative Republicans who were and are very much opposed to Donald Trump, who actually have been doing drills over the last many months for what will happen if there is not a peaceful transfer of power. How will the United States handle that? What will the government do in that regard? And, one of the things that Trump came in, and one of the things that certainly one of his most important advisors, at least at the beginning of his presidency, Steve Bannon, what they wanted to do were break down these norms, these political norms in American society, and deconstruct the federal government. And Trump has done, if that was his goal, he's done an outstanding job of it. And I think what a lot of people are hoping for in Joe Biden is a restructuring and a rebuilding of government to get it back to some of its norms. With where the United States has gone over these last 4 years, that may or may not be possible or a good thing. Even if everything goes perfectly, it's going to take far longer than a single Biden presidency, or maybe even 2 terms of a Biden presidency, to recalibrate and fix some of these problems. And a lot of it has to do with things we've been arguing about for generations, and that is big government versus small government. Republicans view all big government as socialistic. I think it's a rather huge misnomer. I think that the majority of Americans who argue about democratic socialism couldn't define socialism if their life depended on it. And the nature of American society and why we in fact need some elements of government. And it's not, to me, it's not about big government versus small government. It's about effective government. And let me be very, very clear. If we did not have some elements of big, effective government, we would not have been victorious in World War II. We would not have survived the Great Depression. We would not have, won the space race. We would not have defeated the Soviet Union in the Cold War. So this dismantling of government, it to me, as an historian, it's a little crazy.
And one final question from Aisha, who just asked, kind of again going back to the current situation, do you feel that if Joe Biden is declared the winner after all the votes are tabulated, could a legal challenge from President Trump hold up inauguration and stop Biden from taking office?
Nope. Nope. Once the it's a good question, and Aisha is a former student of mine, and she's sitting in England right now. Hi, Aisha. She gets a shout out for attending from. She may be the only attendee from across the pond. No, if the votes are tallied, they will be the Electoral College votes. They tabulate their actual votes. They vote on December 14th, and then on January 6th, the Congress is in the position of accepting those votes. Once we get to that point, if those votes are tabulated and accepted, that's the end. No court challenge is going to stop that, unless Trump has already been able to show voter fraud. And he's going to have to do that on a state-by-state basis. I mean, he could, this was one of the concerns, he could sue where the Supreme Court would pick it up, but it would have to go through the state courts first. And the state's courts have been shutting it down left and right because they can't, the Republican Party, the Trump Party can't show any voter fraud. So no, I seriously doubt that is going to be an issue, though I will not be surprised if he attempts it.
Well, it's going to be an interesting few weeks. And I want to thank you, Matt, for being with us today. It really was an interesting program. And we'll be thinking of all that we learned in the coming days and weeks as we see what's going on in the news. I want to thank all of our viewers out there for your patience with our technical problems. Thank you all for being with us. We really appreciate it. We will be having this program available to you again. I know I kind of want to go back and take a look at it to learn a little bit more as we deal with the current election situation. And before we close, I would just invite you to fill out the survey that we mentioned. And I'd like to just remind you of a couple of upcoming programs and invite you to come back and join us here at Connecticut Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old House. We have coming up in the next couple of weeks a few interesting programs that I think you'll enjoy participating in. On November the 17th at noon is another conversation at noon, Lasting Legacy of the Litchfield Law School, America's first school of law. Interestingly, leaders from both parties attended that law school and got to know one another, so that should be a really interesting discussion. On November the 19th at 7 p.m. is an evening conversation with Joni DiMartino on the future of the Prince Crandall Museum. And then on November 30th at 3 p.m. is Legislative Landmarks, the American School for the Deaf. So we hope you'll join us for those programs. Thank you so much for being with us today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your week.